Welcome to Chat, Communications Happenings and Trends. So today marks the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death, and we would like to take the time to celebrate his life. So MLK was born Michael King Jr. on January 15th, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, to Michael Sr. and Alberta Williams King. In 1934, his father, who had taken the role as a pastor at the Ebenezer's Baptist Church in Atlanta from his grandfather, was inspired after a trip to Germany by the Protestant Reformation leader Martin Luther and had his and his son's name changed. Martin attended a segregated school, Booker T. Washington High School, where his skills as a great speaker became evident on his debate team. In his junior year, he won an oratorical contest sponsored by the Negro Elks Club in Dublin, Georgia. When he was returning home with his teacher from the contest, both were told by the bus driver to stand to make seats for the white passengers. A young, headstrong Martin wanted to refuse, but his teacher convinced him that he should abide because the consequences would be an arrest. King said that during this incident, he was the angriest I have ever been in my life. So at age 15, after skipping grades 9 and 12, King began his higher education at his father and grandfather's alma mater, Morehouse College, in 1944. At this time, Martin was questioning his faith, but with the help of the school's president, theologian Benjamin E. Mays, he decided to follow in his father and grandfather's footsteps. He was ordained before graduating Morehouse with a degree in sociology. So at this time, Martin took his first steps into activism by writing a letter to the editor of the Atlanta Constitution. In the letter, he stated that African Americans were entitled to the basic rights and opportunities of American citizens. So after graduating Morehouse, King went on to attend Prosser Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, from which he graduated 3 years later in 1951 with a Bachelor's of Divinity. He went on to Boston University to work on his doctorate. On June 18, 1953, he married Coretta Scott, who he met while in Boston. Scott was a student and an aspiring singer studying at the New England Conservatory of Music. The couple parented 4 children, and in 1954, King was named pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. In 1955, King received his PhD in systematic theology from Boston University. His dissertation was titled A Comparison of the Concepts of God in the Thinking of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wyman. And during his studies, he worked as an assistant minister at the 12th Baptist Church in Roxbury, Massachusetts. In 1955, a 15-year-old girl named Claudette Colvin refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white man. At this time, King was on the committee of the Birmingham African American community that looked into whether or not they could make a case for initiating a boycott against the Montgomery bus system. One can only imagine how this brought up the old feelings King had from his incident when he was a teenager, having that urge to refuse giving up his seat on his trip back from winning his oratorical contest. However, it was decided because Colvin was a minor that they'd wait for another occurrence to pursue a boycott. And in December of that same year, Rosa Parks' incident became the impetus for that boycott. So these 2 incidents led to the 381-day Montgomery bus boycott, which King was chosen by the community to lead. On January 30th, 1956, King's house was bombed, and his wife Coretta and fellow congregation member Mary Lucy Williams was in the house during that time. Luckily, the 2 heard what sounded like a brick striking the floor of the front porch and moved to the back of the house for safety before the explosion. Martin was also arrested and subject to much abuse during the boycott and beyond. This did not deter him nor his family. So on September 30th, 1956, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the protesters, stating that the segregation of the Alabama bus system was unconstitutional. King's methods of nonviolent protest and this win against the Montgomery bus system helped solidify him as a major figure in the civil rights movement. King, along with about 60 other ministers and activists, formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. With Martin as president, the SCLC began conducting demonstrations and registered people to vote all over the South. King was inspired by both his faith and the teachings of the Indian activist Gandhi to use nonviolent methods, such as protests, boycotts, and sit-ins, even when these were met with violent attacks on himself, his family, and his fellow protesters. From 1956 to 1968, he traveled all over the country, delivering over 2,500 speeches and writing 5 books and countless articles. His most famous speech is called "I Have a Dream" and was delivered symbolically at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 in front of over 250,000 people. During this speech, he made a proclamation that people should not be judged by the color of their skin, but rather by the content of their character. During this time, sadly, the bombing was not the only attempt on his and his family's life, and he was also arrested nearly 30 times. Most of these were from trumped-up charges, such as the time in 1956 in Montgomery, when he was arrested for driving 30 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. Because of his pursuit to champion the rights of those who had very little, at the age of 35, Martin Luther King Jr. became the youngest person to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. He also had been honored by leaders from all over the world. In April of 1968, MLK was in Memphis to lead a protest for sanitation workers' rights. He delivered his speech titled, "I've Been to the Mountaintop." In his speech, he talks of how, if God gave him the opportunity to live at any time in history, he would choose right where he was. He went on to say, "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." This would be his last speech he would give, as the next day, on April 4th, 1968, while standing on his motel room's balcony, he was shot and killed. Though he died that day, his legacy lives on, and sadly, 50 years later, we are still fighting for equality in this country and around the world. But we will always have his words and the content of his own character to guide us through this fight. And fight we will, for someday every single person will all be able to declare, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last."